Here are the deadliest military units in each time period, starting with the Stone Age. Technically, the deadliest military force of the Stone Age wasn't an army at all, because back then, there were no uniforms, no generals, and no battle plans. If you wanted to go to war, here's what you did. Grab the 5 angriest people and agree on one thing. That group over there needs to stop existing. But there was a slight problem. There were no guns, not even a simple bow and arrow. So combat was actually pretty simple. Rocks. Big ones, small ones, sharp ones. So your army was pretty much this. One guy with a sharp rock, and another guy with a slightly less sharp rock. But then some random caveman had a realization that quietly changed warfare forever. Why don't we get a sharpened stone and tie it to a stick? Now you could attack people and animals together in unison. Just like that, the first real Stone Age armies started to appear, and you didn't even need any formal training to join. But the first true military unit would finally arrive in the Bronze Age, where one key discovery would change everything. Humans finally built cities from the ground up, where they could work together to farm and store food. Then one messy accident later, metal was finally born. To spare you the science lesson, the development of bronze was a game changer. Not only did weapons get stronger, but you could now build armor and shields to protect yourself in battle. But the biggest impact on the battlefield wasn't a human. Towering over everything was the deadliest military force of the Bronze Age, the chariot. Imagine being an infantry soldier, armed with nothing but a spear and a shield. All of a sudden, you hear wooden wheels rattling and hooves pounding. Chariots were made to trump the enemy with speed. Horses could carry around spearmen behind, and infantry, they simply had no solutions. The chariot was the LeBron James of its age, but it would eventually be left in the dust. Welcome to the Iron Age. This was a period where metal was no longer gatekept. Iron was everywhere, so weapons costed less and could be made in huge numbers. Just like that, warfare started to change too. Now, when a chariot tried to charge, guess what? You could assemble in larger numbers in a tight spear formation, and the result was goodbye to those horses. Chariot armies weren't the kings no more. That crown would now belong to the cavalry. Instead of being carted along, trained soldiers would now fight from horseback. And these soldiers were protected greatly by iron armor. Not only that, but they thrived on irregular terrain unlike chariots. But make no mistake, it took centuries for horses to finally be strong enough and smart enough for the task. Cavalry units changed the game. But it was in the classical Greek era where warfare got its first true headline act. In this period, you didn't have casual weekend warriors fighting battles. Sparta was a full-time warrior society where every male citizen was basically raised with one job description: fight stuff, and don't break formation. From age 7, Spartan boys went through the famously brutal Augo-G training system, living in barracks, eating hard, and getting tougher. And this would birth the infamous hoplite phalanx. It was basically the ancient world's equivalent of a walking tank brigade. This was a tight rectangle of heavily armored infantrymen standing shoulder to shoulder with huge round shields locked together. They also had long spears pointing out at back. The phalanx created a wall of bronze that was incredibly hard to penetrate. And here's the crazy thing. They weren't always the biggest army. They weren't even professionals. Yet that forward-pressing wall of spears made them the unit everyone in the ancient world whispered about and feared. But over in the Far East, there was about to be a massive shift in warfare. Han Dynasty China took center stage with a military force that had one goal: revolutionize missile troops. Elite archers were always a luxury, and javelins required strong dudes to throw them. The battlefield was stale. But then came the breakthrough. A weapon so powerful even a peasant could do damage. I present to you the crossbow. Crossbowmen were armed with powerful crossbows that could punch through armor and stop enemy charges cold. And here's what made them untouchable. They would line up behind heavy infantry, so there was nothing you could do to stop them. It wasn't about strength anymore, but about technology. Crossbow infantry was centuries ahead of Europe, and it allowed the Han to expand their borders, pushing into Central Asia to secure trade routes and project power. But in the West, an even crazier revolution was about to take place. Welcome to the Byzantine Empire, where the dress code was aggressively purple, and emperors had a shorter average lifespan than a mayfly. But on the battlefield, things were serious. The crown jewel of the army was one of the most intimidating war units of the medieval world, the cataphracts. They were basically cavalry on steroids. Both the rider and the horse were clad in metal plates and mail, turning them into fortresses charging across the field. Cavalry never really had much stopping power. But with cataphracts, you had longer lances to disrupt any formation. Once they got close enough to the front of the enemy line, it caved in as if pushed by a moving wall. But here's the key. Cataphracts could survive missile fire, due to the amount of armor they had. Arrows and javelins tried taking them on the approach, but most of it just glanced off the armor. Byzantine cataphracts weren't the fastest, but when deployed at the right time, they hit hard in a way that shattered morale as much as flesh. Armored riders dominated the Middle Ages, but they wouldn't be untouchable forever. In the late medieval period, knights dominated the battlefield and needed to be stopped. And you know how the old saying goes, never bring a sword to a gunfight. Over in Spain, an elite military unit known as the tercios were about to change warfare forever. Now, they didn't invent guns. No, guns existed well before them. But the tercios were the first army to know how to mask its weaknesses. Firearms were fragile and took long to reload, so the Spanish had the perfect solution. They called it the pike and shot formation. Long thrusting spears, known as pikes, provided an almost unbreakable wall of steel. This gave the firearm troops the protection they needed to reload and retreat, and the result was devastating. A tercio in action was phenomenal at stopping cavalry and infantry alike. It worked so well that Spanish armies using tercios became the army everyone dreaded in the early modern period. Unfortunately for the Spanish, history was about to shove the battlefield off the land. Welcome to the age of sail, where wars weren't fought with your legs, but with floating wooden cities armed to the teeth. Dominating the seas were ships of the line. Basically, it was a moving castle made of oak and stuffed with cannons. Dozens of them, all pointing out the sides like a row of angry metal teeth. These ships weren't just built to look intimidating. They were designed to fight in neat, disciplined columns called the line of battle. Cannonballs tore through hulls, and masts snapped like matchsticks. The ships of the line controlled the ocean. They controlled everything, and if you weren't part of that, you sank. But the ocean couldn't stay king forever. Eventually, war crawled back onto land and brought something much louder with it. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution. It began with factories and smokestacks. But then one crazy dude asked a very human question. What if we made the explosion bigger? Artillery wasn't new. Cannons had been around for centuries, but this was the moment they finally grew up and got organized. Gunpowder became more reliable, and armies realized one thing. Instead of aiming carefully at one target, you could just aim in that general direction and let physics handle the rest. Artillery crews calmly rolled their guns forward, measured the distance, lit the fuse. In an instant, formations turned into clouds of smoke. But if you thought that was unfair, wait till you hear the real innovation: grape shot and canister. Instead of one big cannonball, this bad boy vomited a metal hailstorm that shredded anything in front of it. Artillery succeeded because it didn't care about giving heroic speeches. You just needed coordinates, gunpowder, and a crew willing to reload while their ears rang. Generals loved artillery, but one invention would quietly ruin all of that. In the 20th century, humanity had an abundance of technology to try out on the battlefield, but the deadliest wasn't tank units. No, the real magic happened in the trenches, because soldiers realized that being above ground was getting them killed due to artillery barrages. Welcome to the trenches, where the deadliest units would operate. Enter the machine gun, a weapon which gave one man the firepower of an entire platoon. One gun could lock down an entire field. Multiple guns overlapping turned the entire field into no man's land. So then why did armies still attack these trenches? It wasn't because they were stupid, but because they were trapped between old ideas about courage and not hesitating. The new technology of the machine gun units completely changed the game and took the most lives in World War I.